Den. So I'm very both pleased and honored to introduce Timothy Bewes, who is a professor of English, as well as the interim director of humanities at Brown University. He's the author, most notably, of Cynicism and Postmodernity, which was published in 1997 by Verso, Reification, or the Anxiety of Late Capitalism in 2002, also with Verso, and The Event of Postcolonial Shame in 2011 with Princeton. He's also edited several collections of essays and published numerous articles. Of course, you've had his access to his online profile, so I won't go into the details. Timothy, one of the first questions that we often like to ask people who have been invited in for these type of public discussions of one's work that we refer to as rencontres is to narrate their own intellectual itinerary and give us a sense of kind of what were the germinating questions that were driving you in the development of your research, and how have those questions now brought you to the current project of which we read an excerpt.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. And I just want to begin by thanking you very much for the invitation and for the occasion to discuss both the current project from which the piece that I circulated is from, and the larger trajectory. I'm, in fact, one of the jobs that you, in your nice introduction, that you named me as occupying, I no longer occupy, which is the interim director of the Koget Center for the Koget Institute for the Humanities.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. That has been a very wonderful job. It's where I got to know Gustavo, in fact, who has been a postdoctoral fellow there. But it has taken me a bit away from my project, and this is an occasion to kind of reconnect with it, and I have to now finish it up, has been amazingly invaluable, and it's a great pleasure to reconnect with you, Gabriel, and with everybody in the room. So yes, I mean, I'll give a very broad sort of account of how I ended up in this quite sort of specific conversation with Rancière at the moment. My work to date has emerged in conversation with the history of essentially Marxist thought, and especially the history of its engagement with aesthetic questions. This has sort of become apparent to me as a result of doing this exercise. So I'm grateful in a sense for that. That history of Marxist aesthetics is itself very complex, has many different trajectories. But for me, the important story begins with Lukács. It runs through Adorno, it runs through, to some extent, Deleuze and Bakhtin, who are more recent kind of figures in that narrative for me. And, but both of them are offshoots of the Marxist tradition. And I kind of want to insist on reading them in that context. And then that tradition continues most recently with Rancière, who is the figure, you know, that in the piece that you've been reading about. That piece, I should say, is from a book in progress called Free Indirect: The Idea of 21st Century Fiction, and it's a project in which I'm trying to, in a sense, carry forward this sort of this trajectory of engagement with Marxist aesthetics into a specific theory of the novel, and not a theory of the post-colonial novel, which is kind of partly what I was doing in my last book, but the novel as such. So just to kind of go back to those larger questions around Marxist aesthetics, it will sound silly to state what the questions orienting that field are, because they're so large. But I just will do that just to show you, in a sense, what is really interesting me at the moment. You know, questions like, are categories of art and literature as distinct registers or idioms compatible with a materialist analysis of discourse? I mean, can they be sustained in relationship to a materialist analysis of discourse, or do they collapse? Are those categories still usable? And this is one of the questions that I still want to keep in play. Is art and literature exceptional modes of discourse? I suppose that's the question. Are they, in other words, anything other than expressions of material interests, as, you know, Marx and Engels, certain famous passages in Marx and Engels seem to indicate? Or is art valid for a Marxist analysis precisely because it offers a different logic in relationship to the commodity, as figures like Adorno would want to insist? And really the kind of baldest statement of that question would be something like, is thought possible? Is expression possible? And are art and literature a mode with which we might insist that thought and expression are still possible in the face of a kind of commitment to materialist analysis? So those questions are not remotely resolved for me, but I feel that all my work has been, in a way, circulating them. If there's a kind of foundational concept to the way I've been getting at these questions, it's the concept of reification, which was the topic of my second book, Reification, or the Anxiety of Late Capitalism. And I think it's because reification, at least as I understand it, allows these questions to remain as a kind of problematic, as unresolved, unresolvable. So I mean, people will know probably that reification as a concept is associated with Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, where he develops the theory of reification as a kind of extension of Marx's analysis of the commodity in Capital, as a way to understand the general logic of capitalist psychic life. But what I'm really interested in relationship to reification is that it's a problematic. It's not really a concept. It exceeds its own conceptual status. It keeps all these larger questions in play that I began by outlining, and I think that the sort of point that I'd like to just sort of note at this moment would be to say, what is reified? When we talk about reification, what is reified? And the great insight that we owe to Lukács is that what is reified is not a person, it's really a relation. Reification is an abstraction, an abstract concept in which that relations are obscured or forgotten. In Lukács's reification essay, he says, he talks of it as a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity. So reification is not a representational event. I cannot reify you. You cannot reify me. Capitalism doesn't reify people. It's really something more kind of more to do with. It's not an ethical category, right? I mean, we should not insist that that we not be reified. If I identify with certain subjective categories, if I think of myself as a criminal, or someone else constructs me as a criminal, or I think of myself as somebody in debt, indebtedness. I mean, these are all, I think, expressions of relations that are reifications of those relations. I mean, they are concepts, in fact, that hide certain historical class relations, and in fact obscure them from us. So I just thought, so I would say that's kind of an important principle. The second thing is just to say that, and this is to get into kind of more recent work, since that work on reification, Lukács's concept really emerges out of the theory of the novel, and this is where my own sort of interests have been in the last few years, and something that Lukács says in the theory of the novel, I take to be his first formulation of the theory of reification, but also to be the sort of key to the novel as a form, and certainly to my interest in it. He says that every form is the resolution of a fundamental dissonance of existence. Every form restores the absurd to its proper place as the vehicle, the necessary condition of meaning. So that statement places the novel in a fascinating and enigmatic place in relation to the history of capitalism and to those questions that I began with, and I'm still, you know, trying to tease away at what Lukács might mean by that term, by those words, fundamental dissonance of existence. You know, if the novel is a form, and contemporary literary studies is obsessed with this notion that the novel is a form, what is the fundamental dissonance of existence that the novel as a form resolves? Is that something that the novel thinks in spite of its own formal qualities? So that's kind of what I'm sort of trying to get at in the current, in the current project as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that broad overview. Two quick follow-up questions just about what you've outlined thus far.
Sure.
It's true that there are ways in which, Rancière and even Foucault, who had a major influence over Rancière, could be inscribed in a deeper materialist tradition going back to the Marxist heritage. But there are also very significant ways in which they departed from that tradition and even came out as hostile to it and anti-Marxist. So I'd be curious how or why you would want to keep them or think them, or Rancière more specifically. Deleuze would be another example, of course, who comes up in your article or the chapter, within or related to a Marxist heritage. Where do you see the continuities and where do you see the discontinuities, particularly because they foreground some of the discontinuities? And the follow-up question is rather short, and that is that in your descriptions of your reification, it struck me that we then could perhaps qualify reification as an aesthetic process. And if so, what would that mean? Obviously, in the case of Marx and commodity fetishism, there's an aesthetic understanding of how the relations of global exploitation are invisibilized behind the enchantment with commodities, which have hence an aesthetic quality to them. And so I'd be curious to hear, I know it's a big question, but I'm curious to hear you a bit more on that.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for those questions, Gabriel. Yes, I understand that historically, when Foucault, Deleuze, and now Rancière to some extent, although I think he's in a way he's a more recent figure, given, I mean, even though he's been writing for a long time, his positionality is very different. But in any case, I think you're right that Foucault and Deleuze were at great pains to complicate and sometimes, to disavow their relationship to Marxism. Or to let's say to materialist analysis, but I think we have to read them now very differently to the way that they presented themselves at the time in the grip of kind of very intense sort of intellectual context. And I think that I really would now want to kind of reframe and insist that both of them are utterly coming out of a Marxist tradition that looks a little different now to the way that it looked in the 1980s, for example. It looks, for one thing, it looks very much larger than it did then. Post-structuralist debates were at the time, trying to register a break from Marxism in certain ways. I don't think we can any longer be satisfied with that account that those thinkers were offering at the time. And in fact, they were precisely in wrestling with questions around thought and materialism. They were in the throes of Marxist conversations. So this is why I think that Deleuze's insistence upon, he talks about problematics. A problematic not being something that we have to articulate ourselves, to resolve as thinking subjects. Precisely the notion of the thinking subject as somebody who is enjoined to resolve problematics is itself an idealist concept. So one of the crucial moments, I think one of the crucial interventions of both Foucault and Deleuze is to reject the category of the subject itself as idealistic. Now, at the time, that had to be framed as a kind of challenge to Marxist notions of the subject of history and so on. But I think in my own reading of them is to say that in insisting upon complicating, rejecting the notion of the subject as a unitary category, now we should really read them as contributing to a longer history of Marxist materialist thinking. At least that's certainly how I'm framing them. Somebody like Bergson, the importance of Bergson for Deleuze is, I think, part of that. I mean, if we think about Bergson, the way that Bergson theorized perception, he theorizes perception. Sorry if this is going on, taking us on a bit of a departure, but Bergson theorizes perception in terms of interests. And if I perceive a certain kind of object, I perceive it only insofar as it relates to my interest, insofar as I have an interest in it. I think that Bergson's understanding of interests should be put into conversation with Marx and Engels's understanding of material interests, and someone like Deleuze enables us to do that. Reification, an aesthetic process. I don't know, Gabriel. Is it?
Maybe I should qualify that. Aesthetic in the Marxist sense of what Marx was talking about in the 1844 manuscripts, for instance, and that is that our entire sensory apparatus has been forged by the history of our social relations. And so we don't perceive the world as it is, or just due to subjective projections.
Yeah.
We perceive it based on how our perceptual apparatus has formed us as social agents, right? So it's not aesthetics in the sense of like bourgeois art, but aesthetics in this more expansive Marxist sense, if you will.
Right.
I
Yes.
should have qualified.
No. Okay. That's actually completely helpful. Yes, I think that. I mean, what Marx is doing in those 1844 manuscripts, in particular, the third manuscript, when he talks about private property and communism, and he essentially, when he talks about aesthetics, I think that he's talking about art without using the term art. In other words, he is, I mean, it's as close as Marx comes to developing a kind of aesthetic philosophy or theory of aesthetics that we could put into conversation with Deleuze, for example. In other words, sensation, essentially. So, absolutely, you're completely right about that. I think that that for Marx, when he theorizes communism in those early manuscripts, when he theorizes it in the positive sense, because he also theorizes it in the negative sense, but when he theorizes it in the positive sense, what communism might be, it is something like a kind of, there's an aesthetics to it. I mean, I think this is maybe this touches on what your question is, Gabriel. In other words, it's something like a non-reified experience or mode of life in which I'm no longer a shoemaker, because I make shoes from 9 till 5. I'm a human in this very kind of nuanced way that Marx wants to use the term human. I'm a human because I may make shoes from 9 till 10 a.m. But I'm also like milking my goat and construct and building my house and essentially living in something like a kind of non-reified existence, and that non-reified existence necessarily partakes in aesthetics, in art, without necessarily me being an artist, and without the activities that I undertake necessarily being nameable as art and literature. And so, I mean, I hope this is kind of in a way where you were going with that.
Absolutely.
Because this is, yes, I think that, I mean, Marx very rarely mentions the term reification, but if we read those early manuscripts, then he's getting at something that is very, very close to a theory of reification and a theory of art and aesthetics, I think. So yeah,
Great. Let me just follow up by, if we turn our attention a little bit more directly to the article/chapter that you shared with us,
Yeah.
in discussing it, obviously this is a very erudite intervention into a complex field. And so as we talked about before, maybe just clarifying what the big stakes of this argument are would be helpful for us to see based on kind of where you're coming from and what you've outlined thus far.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, but correct me if any of this is wrong or incorrect, that one of the things that you're interested in is how Rancière has developed an account of 3 different regimes of art, art I put here in quotes, in order to contest the idea that there's a universal practice or thought or concept of art that has existed in all time and all cultures.
Right.
But that in doing that, he's developed this largely, you know, if I can permit myself the reference, a kind of Hegelian framework of, you know, you have Plato and Aristotle in the classical age, and then you have the modern age with Hegel, surprise, Schiller and others. And that this tripartite account of the history of Western art, which he only really began saying in 2011. Prior to that, unless I missed something, he would just refer to, you know, the entire globe as if there were just these 3 regimes.
Right.
And it seems that one of your major preoccupations, and I'd like to kind of maybe drill into this a little bit because there's a lot of tangential questions that could spin off of it. It seems that one of your preoccupations is the ways in which he gives us a kind of totalizing account that seems rather inescapable, particularly when it comes to the aesthetic regime of art. That the aesthetic regime of art, as he says, is the regime that constitutes really art in the singular, while at the same time entering into a contradiction of the art of the commonplace, by which I would mean that art in the aesthetic regime opens up the subject matter of art so expansively that anything can, in principle, and that's an important qualifier, become art. So anything can be art, including colorful butt plugs or a book on nothing, if you take a more erudite reference point. And so art constitutes itself while opening itself up to everything at the same time. And it's just constantly caught in this contradiction.
Right.
And I take it that one of your preoccupations is, well, why is it that it seems that there's no egress from the aesthetic regime, that there's a more kind of totalizing capacity to this regime? And are there spaces either within this regime or, following up on that, I'd say outside of perhaps this regime that would contest it? So I guess first and foremost is that I'm just trying to give the big picture overview. Is that adequate? What do we need to add or correct to what I've said? And then maybe we can get into some of the details.
Yeah, you absolutely. I mean, you've, in a way, you've named the great predicament of Rancière's work for me and for anybody who ever kind of like pays attention to him, I think, which is to say, is this a totalizing account? Are we locked into the aesthetic regime? How historical are these three great, you know, boluses of thinking? And what does it mean? What might it mean to, I mean, can we, and what is the stakes, you know, what are the stakes of thinking about art in terms of these 3 great regimes? What are the stakes for Rancière, for example, insisting that there is no distinction between a realist literature, you know, as theorized by Roland Barthes or Lukács for that matter, and something like a kind of postmodern literature, you know, theorized by Jameson and Lyotard. I mean, these are kind of, absolute insistences in Rancière's thinking. And for me, it all comes to a head a little bit in his reading of Deleuze, where Deleuze wants to say, cinema is a mode of thinking that is not essentially, I mean, I'm paraphrasing him, is essentially a mode of thinking that is not rooted in any kind of intellectual or theorizable regime. Cinema is a mode of escape from let's say from ideology, in a sense. I mean, really, in the end, like, this is what Deleuze is saying, and I think that Rancière's critique of Deleuze on that basis is a I mean, one has to think about it partly in ideological terms. Is there then no escape from ideology? So let me just sort of like say something about the Rancière chapter, and then maybe I could talk about the larger project that it's from, because the argument of my chapter involves the question of precisely the question of a limit to Rancière's system of artistic regimes. And at one point I phrased the question on 14: is there a power of art or a capacity for thought? I wanted to pull this out when I was rereading last night. Is there a power of art or a capacity for thought that is captured in, say, Deleuze's analytic of the sensory motor collapse, or in Lukács's veiled references to an unsurmounted element in the novel, but that remains unaccounted for by Rancière's notion of the aesthetic regime? And which is the question, can the novel think, right, in a sense? Can the novel think, or is it merely, replaying certain kind of forces that are eminently relatable to a certain regime of aesthetics already theorized by Rancière? My answer to that question is yes. But the particular claim I want to be making, understood to be making, and this is where it is really drilling into the argument of the chapter, because it's where I think I'm trying to make a gesture for a new reading of Rancière, is that in answering yes to that question, we're not simply challenging or questioning Rancière's schema. What we're doing is identifying within Rancière's own writing a kind of non-identity, a non-identity to that writing in which his own thought can be seen to diverge from its own formal or rhetorical qualities. So I'm wanting to say that Rancière wants to insist that there's nothing outside the regime, the aesthetic regime, but in fact, the enigmatic quality of Rancière's writing, the fact that he is very difficult to pin down as making a statement that he himself owns or justifies or explains rhetorically, the fact that it's very difficult to attribute anything in Rancière's writing to him essentially means that he has himself entered the aesthetic regime in such a way as to illustrate its limitations. He doesn't ever talk about its limitations. In fact, he says the precise opposite. But the limitations of his schema are demonstrated in his work, and therefore it's possible to separate Rancière's own thinking from itself, for one thing, from the aesthetic regime that he wants to insist is taking place everywhere, which means that we are in a new regime, right? We are in a new aesthetic regime. It's a regime that is non-speakable, and it's also a way in which we can reconcile Rancière with Deleuze, and in a sense bring Rancière very close to Deleuze, and to say that the very definition of the current regime is one that Rancière exemplifies without himself articulating. Does that make sense? Anyway. That's my answer.
Yeah. There's a lot packed into what you've said. Maybe I can follow up with, and these are relatively, I think, at once naive questions, but I hope questions that will resonate with some of the participants in the workshop, given the conversations that we had last week.
Yeah.
One is that if you're looking for an exit from the aesthetic regime, and you've kind of just qualified this in Rancière's own discursive performance, if you will, or I don't know how exactly you'd want to qualify it. One thing that comes to mind, and this comes out in a footnote, the footnote on Toni Morrison, for instance, right, is, and it's a regular conundrum in relationship to the canonized history of bourgeois Western art. And if one is looking within that canon for an exit from that canon, one of the things, of course, it always makes me think is, well, why look there as opposed to outside of that canon and look to all of the cultural practices that have been excluded, marginalized, etc. So given your work on post-colonialism, a kind of major question for me that comes away from reading this is, well, what about all of the types of aesthetic practice that are irreducible to the ways in which the bourgeois practice and concept of art has been consolidated. And of course, we could say more about this around genius figures who tap into their inner soul in order to create a product that is marketable and can be shopped around in museums. And, you know, we could get into all the details about this, but just going really, really quickly. And then a second question in relationship to that, and sorry that they're a bit expansive, but it's really what interpolated me in reading you,
Sure.
is what about, even within the European tradition, a more kind of materialist account of the forces that are operative in the production of particular discourses, specific cultural practices that would look at the forces of production, the forces of distribution, so how these art products or discourses are circulated through the social field, and also the reception and how that reception is either programmed or staged in various ways by an entire cultural apparatus.
Right.
Because I think in one sense, you're absolutely right that Rancière understands himself as somehow discursively manifesting elements of the aesthetic regime, but you're also pointing out that this creates perhaps contradictions in his own practice. But another way of understanding that would be that he is a materialist manifestation of a certain bourgeois practice of reflection on European art and an attempt to identify its internal logic without ever mining down into the structural elements that have produced that logic. And this would actually come full circle because it's a very Foucaultian. Foucault is very good at giving a materialist account of epiphenomena while ignoring the root forces that have driven them and produced them in the first place, as well as the question which you raised in relationship to Rancière, and that is how could you possibly transform them, right? And instead you have a kind of hands-off diagnostic that might seem materially compelling at a superficial level, but it never gives us a radical analysis. It never goes to the root of these things and demonstrates how they were produced and how they could potentially be changed. So sorry if I'm trying to pack a lot in, but both of those questions, the kind of post-colonial question and then the materialist question of production, circulation, and reception, I'd love to hear you on, given your work on Marxism, post-colonialism, but then also your interest in Rancière.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Well, let me take the first question first. I'm happy you brought up the footnote on Morrison. I've been thinking about it quite a bit, actually, that footnote, and trying to kind of figure out what the stakes of that are, because it's really a kind of unfinished footnote. I mean, I'm sure you notice that. But the question of the canon, I mean, okay, the novel, I'm trying to essentially remove, I mean, re-understand the novel, not in terms of canon formations and not in terms of genres, not in terms of a real history of the novel, not in terms of institutions of the novel, all of which, of course, are massively important, certainly massively important to any kind of Marxist analysis of literature, right? But the angle upon the novel that I'm taking is heavily influenced by Bakhtin, who, in a sense, wants to present the novel as a logic, not as a set of institutions and a canon, and in fact to identify within the novel a logic that is inimical to any kind of institutional or canonical account of the novel. And in fact, the novel doesn't really, for Bakhtin, the novel doesn't really exist, even as a form, and certainly not as a genre. And this is I'm also trying to buy into that, but certainly trying to insert myself into that idea of the novel. And I've been thinking a bit about that moment in when Morrison talks about essentially race and in fact blackness in the history and the canonical history of American literature as something that is absent from the novel, from the this claim that blackness is absent from the history of the novel in the way that it has conceived and presented itself as a canon. And one of the pieces that I've been very looking at recently is James Baldwin has a essay called Notes for a Hypothetical Novel, where he imagines writing a novel. It's in 1960, he goes and gives a talk to Esquire magazine, and he begins to imagine on his feet, a kind of writing a particular, a hypothetical novel that will have all the qualities that a novel will have. It will have certain characters, and like every great novel, it will not tell us what to think about it, right? What it will do is it will merely put into play a certain kind of set of characters, and the idea behind the novel will emerge from the artistry of the text. So he says, that these words, this means that I do not want to tell the characters or the reader what principle their lives illustrate or what principle is activating their lives. But by examining their lives, I hope to be able to make them convey to me and to the reader what their lives mean. But then he goes on to say this: because I am an American writer, my subject and my material inevitably has to be a handful of incoherent people in an incoherent country. And what he means by incoherent, I think, is precisely what Morrison means when she talks about the 400-year presence of Africans and then African Americans in the United States. So one sort of like answer to the question, Gabriel, I'm not sure if this is quite answers your question, but one answer to the question might be that American literature, in particular, the 400-year history of American literature, has it's possible to name let's say the fundamental dissonance of existence that Lukács talks about, in the novel. It's possible to give a name to that. One of the names is race. In other words, a name to the relations that are being obscured by the overt and apparent canonical presence of a certain kind of themes within American literature. So perhaps within the context of American literature, one might name that entity race or blackness. But the second thing to say, I think, which Baldwin doesn't say, but Morrison does say it in certain places, and people like Achille Mbembe say it, is that race cannot be the final name for that failure of connection, or that fundamental dissonance, for the simple reason that race does not exist. Race is a form. Race is an invention. Race is, in fact, is a reification, one could almost say. And at the basis of the form that is race is, something else, some kind of fundamental set of relations. And I think that the thing that I would want to say is that the novel as a form, the novel as a tradition, as a mode of thought, is able to think, the inadequacy of race itself as a form, the inadequacy of even blackness as a form. In other words, the fact of race as a fiction, despite the fact that it has real effects and the limitations of those effects, the limitations even of race as a form, even of blackness as a form. Anyway, that's just how I'm kind of thinking about that question right now. And crucial to it is this notion that the novel, of course, has a canon. Of course, it has a set of institutions and practices, and of course, it has a history that is, populated with real actors who have restricted and limited and dominated the development of the novel as a form, and yet even in the very insistence and recognition of that, the novel is not that. It is something other than that. This is what I think Bakhtin sort of like presents us with. And in a way, even though, Gabriel, this is going to be an inadequate answer to that other question that you're asking, I want to sort of, about sort of forces of production, distribution, reception. I want to kind of, and I probably will not quite do this in this project, but I do want to also mobilize then this kind of idea of the novel as always other than that history of real institutional practices, as the answer, in a sense, to the question that you're asking. Also, I think Foucault is an interesting figure to mobilize, because I think Foucault is so close to Rancière in his own writing practices. He himself is so he writes essentially in something like a free and direct discourse, in a huge, in almost everything he writes. There's a large component of that. He said at one point in an interview, I think sometimes that the only thing I've ever really been able to produce is fictions. This is what I'm writing, is fictions. I think that there's a very strong and rich, thick, let's say a thick theory of fictionality that is present in that statement, that he never really unpacked or thought through, but that I would be quite interested in doing. Does that answer? No,
that's really helpful. I mean, I do see a risk, but this might also be, and it's always important when we have speakers in, everybody's pushing in different directions. And so this might be a divide between the work that we're respectively doing. Is I see a risk of idealism, the risk that there would be a certain form or certain experience or certain way of writing that would recognize that it's materially produced or embedded in particular ways, but yet nonetheless there would be some spirit or essence or something that would rise above those material forces, which is not at all to say that everything is reducible to an absolute, banal, monocausal, determinist account. There are very complex materialist modes of analysis. But let me maybe give really one very concrete example of what I'm talking about, because I also want to make sure as we navigate this conversation, because we tend to go up into the theoretical clouds, but then I also want us to have it be a grounded enough conversation that everybody can kind of get a sense of the stakes of what we're talking about. And after this, I should probably stop so we can open it up for a broader conversation, unless, Timothy, you want to follow up and talk a little bit more about where this project is headed in future projects. But the question that I had in mind really came out as well in the article that you shared, because for someone like Rancière, Flaubert is quintessentially important. You could say that he is the author for Rancière in many ways, because Flaubert made a very important statement that he repeated in various ways throughout his correspondence, mainly in the 1850s. The most famous iteration of that is that for him, there are ni beau ni vilain sujets. There are neither noble nor ignoble subjects. So the novel can be written about anything. And about an adulterous woman, it could be written about a pebble, it could be written about nothing. And Rancière really celebrates this as the manifestation of the discourse on equality and the abolition of the idea in the representative regime that there's a hierarchy of subject matter, and you should only make art about, generals on the battlefield and major politicians and other such things. No, you could make it about anything. And what's really unique about this is I think it shows that, yes, there's an internal logic to Flaubert's text, which I could say more about, because I think Rancière's reading of that is incorrect. But what he doesn't get—
correct or incorrect, do you say?
Incorrect, which I could detail quickly if you like. But the larger materialist account is that Rancière would never have read those passages if the correspondence of Flaubert hadn't been published. Flaubert did not want his correspondence published. Many of his interlocutors didn't want, and his friends didn't want his correspondence published. The reason his correspondence was published is because his niece, Caroline Comenville, undertook to make his letters public. And she did that in part because he was a famous French author, and it was very lucrative. Everybody wanted to read everything by this particular author. And so she made the private subject public, if you will. And so there's not simply an internal logic to the text. The conditions of possibility for Rancière's argument about the equality of discourse presupposes the inequality that is structurally inscribed in the production of texts and in a canon in which Flaubert's correspondence is widely read and many others authors' correspondence is thrown in the trash, not published, not circulated, certainly not debated by French intellectuals. And so in that regard, the very texts that we choose to analyze the internal logic of are already the result of a material history that we have to have an account of.
Right.
And just very quickly as a follow-up, the thing that Rancière misses in Flaubert is the reason that he says that that you can have an equality of subject matter is because there's an aristocratic mode of seeing, right? And it's that the author can aristocratically see a pebble or nothing and make it into this magnificent work of art. And there's this great line about Flaubert where he says that the only people interested in the banal are the common people and the great, right? Because the great, so there's an aristocratic vein to all of Flaubert's reflections on the equality of discourse. It's only equal because he makes it equal. And that's inscribed within the hierarchy of a great author and a non-great author, or literature in the bourgeois sense and writing that's not, you know, elevated to that status. So sorry for the length of the question. You could pick up on any of the threads that you like, and it might also just be a parting of ways and a different way of engaging with this body of literature, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, the question about idealism is really a crucial question, and actually, I think we've discussed this before once.
Probably.
And it was, and when we discussed this before, it came down to a relation, a commitment to, or let's say, a willingness to like or read or accept Deleuze or not. And I think that Deleuze actually is the key, for me at least. It's the key to this question, because you're completely right that idealism cannot, I mean, let's say, in a sense, the answer, even the answer that I'm trying to phrase here, even the question of the thinkable, or the question of the of thought, I mean, it cannot be thought as such. In other words, it cannot be subjectively inhabited, because if there is if there is a thinkable freedom from the artistic regime, it is certainly not thinkable by us. And this is why I think Deleuze's interest in cinema, which I haven't really touched on yet, but it's really crucial to the larger project that this paper is from, because for Deleuze, the way to escape from idealism is in fact to escape from any kind of constraint around the subject when it comes to thought. So when he names what cinema is able to do, what cinema is able to think, the thought that cinema is able to arrive at, which for Deleuze completely relies on space and time. In other words, when we think space and time as, you know, human subjects, we're always relating it to our own situatedness in relationship to space and time. We cannot think space and time as such. We can only think them, you know, anthropomorphically. But for Deleuze, the fact of the cinematic apparatus is the explanation for something that cinema is able to create for the first time, essentially, which is to say, a cinematic thought or a cinematic perception. In other words, a non-subjective perception, a non-subjective thinking of time and space in themselves. So this is a very large leap, which I probably will not be able to quite, you know, manage to explain. But the project that I'm, you know, working on is to try to say that, in fact, when Deleuze makes this innovation in relationship to cinema, it's not a Deleuzian invention. He's taking it from the novel, and that, in fact, he's taking it from both Lukács, but even more particularly Bakhtin in the novel. And the notion of a non-subjective, non-centered, non-subjective thought is what Bakhtin in particular enables us to begin to kind of conceptualize in relationship to the novel, and that's essentially where the notion of the free indirect, which is the title of the book, of my book, I mean, is important, because I'm trying to get away from the notion of a free indirect discourse, which is a kind of represented discourse. The free indirect is something like a logic to discourse, which is for Deleuze at least, all language is framed by this essentially non-subjective logic, essentially, to it. What was your other? Oh yes, Rancière, I agree with you, Gabriel, about Rancière's failure to, in a sense, to, I mean, his dependence upon Flaubert's correspondence, and in particular, his idealist in a different sense, idealizing understanding of the democratic nature of Flaubert's novel. I think he's gesturing towards something. He yearns for it to be the case. He, much as he does in much of his work. I mean, if you read, you know, the Ignorant Schoolmaster, the way that he frames this, you know, Jacotot, the French 19th century, or Belgian maybe, is he 19th century school teacher, as having evolved an entirely new pedagogical model predicated upon the equality of the schoolmaster and the student. I mean, it's a sort of yearning that could be the case. When Rancière, you know, pays attention to workers, 19th century workers who are capable of aesthetic experience in proletarian nights, he's yearning for that to be the case. And I think Rancière's whole project is a very gestural one. And, you know, I mean, I think it's a larger discussion about Rancière, but I agree. I don't think he can't possibly do the work, given what he wants to do with art and literature. He can't possibly do the work that would underpin it adequately. And I think it's possible that my account of Rancière is, I mean, I need to find ways, I think, to acknowledge that I mean, this is what I'm trying to do actually, but to acknowledge that sort of shortfall in Rancière's thinking.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I definitely want to hear about the kind of the future trajectory of this project, but I feel like as timekeeper, I should also be cognizant of that and maybe trust in the fact that during the Q&A, this will come up. And Timothy, don't hesitate to allude to kind of where you're headed. So if anyone wants to get on Stack, just put your hand up. If you can't do that, then you can type your name in the chat. And I'm going to keep an eye on it. If nobody jumps on right away, then I would ask you the follow-up question, Timothy, of how, I know this is a book in progress. Oh, I already see Jared Bly. Okay, everybody's jumping on now. So Jared, why don't you unmute yourself and jump in?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Veil myself. Thanks a lot. This is very interesting. I want to continue this conversation. I'll just read a little bit just to keep my thoughts structured, because Gabriel will attest I could probably just spin off into the heavens with this discussion. But so I'm just curious about how Lukács's thought triangulates in this discussion about cinema between Rancière and Deleuze, and how you might sort of expand upon Lukács's contribution to this discussion. So I take it if dialectics in the Lukácsian sense is thinking in terms of a historical process and from the point of view of action or praxis, as he says, if dialectics is sort of the antidote to reification, or at least the method by which reifications of a given mode of production are superseded or overcome, and just like ideology, there's really no exit point, as you said, of reification. So I take it that and given from your article as well that we read, that you're reading Deleuze's books on cinema, that they could be read in the Lukácsian sense as sort of the process of development by which the medium of cinema, especially from the sensory motor linkage of the action image to the advent of the time image, the medium of cinema dialectically overcomes its own internal reifications, especially the reification between perception and motion that characterized the early cinema, according to Deleuze. And so I want to know what you thought about sort of that formulation. And then a sort of secondary just concern is then coming back to Rancière, sort of perhaps echoing some of the things Gabriel stated. So Rancière says that cinema is, in terms of regimes, is sort of suspended between the representative and the aesthetic regime. So I'm just wondering, given his formulation, how does that stand with respect to these categories, Lukácsian categories of dialectics and reification that I see you sort of synthesizing with Deleuze's project on cinema? So hopefully that's clear.
Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you, Jared. Does the medium of cinema overcome dialectically its own internal reification? I don't think I have a problem with that formulation. I mean, it's not like it's not quite how I'm thinking of it, but I think that the one reason why I think that you're onto something is that Lukács himself, in a very early text called something like Notes Toward a Philosophy of the Cinema, which you know is I mean, it's like 1913 or something, so it's well before the appearance of sound cinema, but he does there write about cinema in ways that that look almost Deleuzian. I mean, it's kind of quite crazy, but he almost is talking about cinema in terms of sensation, in terms of the abolition of literature, in terms of a non-subjective, something like a non-subjective encounter with time and movement. So this is in Lukács's pre-Marxist phase. So so he's not yet thinking or formulating his ideas in terms of dialectics, and yet I think he's not using that language, but and yet he very much sort of is. I mean, dialectics. I mean, it's one of these dialectics is one of these terms that is problematic. It's in play all the time. Bakhtin insists that dialectics is not dialogics, and that the novel is a dialogical form, not a dialectical form. So I think that, you know, I think one would have to do a certain amount of work to frame the formulation as you've presented it. But I think one could do that, and it would. I think it's, you know, very interesting. In terms of, can I just ask you, where does Rancière say that cinema is suspended between the representative and the aesthetic regimes?
I take that from le Fables cinématographique, the film fables. I believe that precise formulation of suspended between the two regimes actually comes from the preface by the English translator, but in reading most of those essays, that seems to be that there's an ambiguity to cinema, which also sort of, I mean, it echoes the ambiguity between the two ages of cinema that Rancière points out with respect to Deleuze's reconstruction of the history of cinema. So it's there's a constitutive sort of almost material, if you will, ambiguity about cinematic images that they're visible through both regimes, etc. Right?
Yeah, I mean, Rancière on cinema, I find the least satisfactory of any of his writing, because it's kind of evolving in a way, right? He you know, he writes all these essays in film fables, including this critique of Deleuze, which I think he's so deeply influenced by Deleuze on cinema, and yet can't quite acknowledge it. He then later writes this book on Bellatar, which is so Deleuzian. I mean, he couldn't have written that book without Deleuze's time image. He's presenting Bellatar as essentially a Deleuzian filmmaker. I mean, there are differences. But they're so slight. It's such a Deleuzian book. And then he writes The Intervals of Cinema, where he says, I'm not really a cinema theorist. You know, I'm just writing this book as a cinephile. I you know, take it or leave it. And again, it's very Deleuzian. And so, you know, it's as if one can be a Deleuzian for Rancière. One can analyze cinema in a Deleuzian way, but you're not really doing the real work. You're a cinephile if you're doing that, and I'm going to do it as a cinephile. So I think I think that one has. I mean, really, it doesn't. I'm not sure that I would buy the formulation that you presented, that cinema is between the representative and the aesthetic regime. I think it has to be part of the aesthetic regime in a Rancièrean sort of framework. This is certainly the basis of his critique of Deleuze in Film Fables. But I think he's an evolving thinker when it comes to cinema, and I don't think he's quite at a satisfactory moment of conceptually in relationship to cinema. That's my feeling about Rancière.
Thanks. Let's talk more.
Sure.
Great. I think we'll move on to Scott next. And just so I saw in the chat, everybody knows stack is just me taking the order in which people raise their hand, and the raise hand function is at the bottom of your Zoom. So raise it. If you're on your phone or something, you can just type your name into the chat and I should be able to see it. But Scott, go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question, please.
Thanks. I mean, I love this discussion, and the piece is really wonderful, and thanks for sharing it, you know, in progress. One of the things that like, to echo what Gabriel said, my like naive question is sort of why save art or literature? And this is something I like keep writing about and wondering about and trying to answer. And that's not to say like to destroy the practices of art and literature, but to save it as this idea that we like write about and produce all this like stuff about and enshrine. And that to me like is sort of the feeling I kept getting like reading about about Flaubert and all these like great authors, versus like some of the story that you're telling in the footnotes, right, about like the kind of material production of film, the amount of money that goes into making it, etc. And so that's like my one question, and I guess that could be another way of phrasing the other question, which is like old and maybe tired, and maybe you have another way of approaching it of like, what is a committed literature, or like what is the political space of literature? I question the term politics personally, but like that's like the most convenient way of thinking about it, I think. Yeah, because that's like sort of bracketed, even though that word is used to talk about this. So yeah, why save art or literature?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Scott. Well, first of all, we don't need to save art or literature. I mean, I don't have any investment in that whatsoever. Art and literature, the only reason to pay any attention to it at all is that it happens, and it, you know, it's an activity and it's taking place and it's doing some work. And I think if it's doing some work, then the question is, what work is it doing? So that's the question that drives me. I don't care if the history of literature disappeared. You know, I just would not care about that at all. That's the too easy answer to the question. I think that the second question, though, I mean, it sounds like a related question, but it's such a different question. Like, what is a committed literature? And that, I think, is a really, of course, it's an enigmatic question. It's the Marxist thinking has been convulsed by that question, by what that question might mean, how one might address it. Since the beginning, Deleuze's answer to that. I mean, essentially, the figures that I'm most interested in on that question, which would be, you know, Adorno and Deleuze, really both seem to discount it. I mean, really kind of like have no interest whatsoever in a committed literature, or to say that a committed literature is by definition not committed. I mean, this would be Adorno's answer. You know, this is the problem with Sartre, is that Sartre's committed literature reinscribes us within categories of thinking that are themselves part of part of the problem. Which is to say, capitalism, commodification, and that the precise committed importance of art is in breaking all of the promises that art issues to us, which is to say, happiness, beauty. You know, the only kind of committed literature in a capitalist society, in other words, a society of total reification, is one that refuses the very space of artistic expression that capitalism makes for it. So you know, I think that to return to this former idealism, I think there's something idealistic in any kind of statement that says a committed literature should be or could be this. Even to say a committed literature should not explicitly solicit a kind of political reading, because literature takes place. It seems to me that even in explicitly political literature, could be and should be read, perhaps for what it is not saying as much as for what it is saying. So that's my, anyway, it's probably overly complex answer to just difficult question.
Well, thank you, Jackson. I believe you're up next.
Thank you. I really enjoyed reading your chapter, and I had two questions while I was reading it that I hope will be a little bit more clear now that I've heard you speak a bit about it. The first one has to do with the notion of the symptomatic reading, which you brought up at one point when you were talking about Rancière's definition of literature. And it interests me in part because I see the symptomatic reading as maybe one of the major vestiges of Althusser's thought in Rancière. And to be clear, I guess, about what I mean, I'm saying a reading that seeks the unstated question to an offered answer, and therefore less than a form of interpretation is actually a form of knowledge production.
Right.
And so I'd be curious how you see the symptomatic reading as operational in Rancière's thought. And then second, I feel like I detected your own interpretation of Rancière as being a form of symptomatic reading insofar as you're seeking the unstated question that he's trying to answer. So that's the first question. And then the second one has to do with Beckett and just earlier in the three dialogues, I don't remember which one it is, but one of the first two, he talks about this idea of an obligation to express even when deprived of all agency and tools. And I would just be curious about if you see any connection between what you were calling the totalizing and inescapable logic of the aesthetic regime and what Beckett refers to as the obligation to express.
Okay. Thank you. Amazing, amazing, wonderful questions, Jackson. Symptomatic reading, I take it from your question, and if this is your position, I agree, is that when Rancière talks about symptomatic reading, he's not really using it with the same rigorous, and complex use that Althusser puts forward in Reading Capital. Althusser's use of I think you stated it as, paraphrased as a reading that states the unstated question that is, and that, in other words, that thinks the question that is, that reads for the question that is, that makes possible the reading itself. It's something like that, right? In Althusser, it's really so fascinating, and it's so kind of like complex. And Rancière, strangely, it's really strange that he does this because Rancière was a student of Althusser, contributed in the writing of Reading Capital, was in intense dialogue with Althusser. But I don't think that Rancière is using the term symptomatic reading in the way that Althusser is reading it. I think he's using it in this very banal way, as kind of like to mean interpretation. It's essentially interpretation for what is not there, something like that. Very sort of straightforward. Very straightforward reading, and that's what he kind of wants to say is part of the aesthetic regime. So the aesthetic regime, the work of art in the aesthetic regime is dependent upon a practice of symptomatic reading that reads for what is not there. In other words, it's part of the same dispositif of, the aesthetic regime. And I don't think that's what Althusser is getting at. And when you say that my own interpretation of Rancière is a symptomatic reading, I hope that's the case in the Althusserian way, because that's what I would like to be. That's what I would like to be doing with Rancière, is to say, I'm not uncovering something that is there in Rancière. I'm, in a sense, creating something out of a reading of Rancière that. And the thing that I'm creating is the very possibility of reading Rancière in this way. That, I take it to be what Althusser is getting at when he theorizes reading as a guilty reading. A guilty reading is always a reading that has certain stakes and a certain kind of history to it. Beckett, your question is about whether the total logic of the aesthetic regime is adequately summed up by the obligation to express as articulated by,
or what you see as the relationship between
Yeah.
the obligation to
yeah.
express?
Well, I think Beckett Beckett hates art, essentially. Hate doesn't hate the practice of art, but hates the institution of art, the framing of art and aesthetics. Hates the very notion of the subject. Can't stand the idea that the work that he's doing is expressive in any way. In other words, Beckett is very close to a conception of art that is not remotely framed not only by the institutions of art, but by the very order of expression, the very subjectivity of artistic expression. And of course he's struggling constantly to erase all those elements of artistic practice that he wants to escape, and sees occasionally, like as in the three painters that he is paying attention to in those dialogues, sees occasionally evidence that such a kind of non-expressive, non-representative practice might be possible. And you know, I think expression is a problematic for Beckett, which is why he's so important to Deleuze. And I think it's also maybe why did I include this footnote in there? An interview with Beckett, with Rancière by Nina Power, where Rancière says, I have no interest in Beckett. It was in English, they were speaking English, and he says this. Anyway, does that answer your question, Jackson?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I think next up is Danish Iqbal, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello?
Yes,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Thank you, Professor Timothy. I would rather begin by making two quick confessions. One is that I have not read Rancière so far, and this was my first encounter through your writings. And my familiarity with the Marxist literary aesthetics is mostly by reading of people like Eagleton and Mashley, etc.
Who was
the second confession is...
Who was the second name that you... What was the second name you said?
Theo Mashley.
Oh, Mashley, yeah.
Yeah. And then my question is two-part, and at the risk of sounding absurd, I would still kind of put it out. I come from India, so...
Very quickly, if I think there's some sound interference in the background, anything you could do to avoid wind or speak directly into the microphone would be helpful.
Okay, I'm
for
sorry.
The audio feed.
Ceiling fan.
That's much better.
Better.
Much better, much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So, early on during your conversation here, you mentioned that you were trying to work out the idea of human by talking about, in terms of Marx, that how when we do things as part of our daily life and when we work as homo fabers, possibly. That kind of took me to think about Hannah Arendt's distinction between labor and work, and the famous example of the table in the human condition. But gradually, when your talk kind of took up the idea of form and genre of novel based on the work of Lukács, I was increasingly thinking about how to ground this in the post-colonial condition, and particularly with my interest in the question of secularism. So when Lukács remarks that, this in his theory of novel, it's a form that has been abandoned by a world. I mean, it takes shape in a world that has been abandoned by God. That relates to the question of sacred and vulgar or profane, so to speak. So the question that I'm trying to configure here by thinking about Rancière. That is, when Rancière says that the political activity reconfigures the distribution of the perceptible, and I'm quoting you here from that article, do you think these two notions, in terms of artistic or literary activity, relate to the question of secularism, particularly summoning the recent critical scholarship, which has expanded the debate around secularism to take into account sensibilities, the sensory activities, the practices, the habitations, habulatory exercises, a whole lot of these perceptive activities, so to speak. So, and that has kind of brought into question the very status of novel as a secular formation. So when I say secular, I'm not only talking about a political doctrine, I'm talking about a certain kind of disposition. So can we say that a formulation of novel, I'm sure you're aware of the Rushdie affair, and there are a lot of debates around the novel, that, the ban on the novel, etc., and the debates that it kind of engendered. But in the contemporary times, when we are talking about the resurgence of religion and the resurgence of various proclamations that kind of cut across these neat divisions, where do you see novel as a form or even a genre against the background of such a post-colonial contemporary situation? Thank you. I'm not sure how clear I am, but if you could respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Danish. It's kind of a crucial question and a sort of very, very large one, obviously. It seems to me that, I mean, the novel is a secular form. I mean, this is essentially what Lukács means by a world, the form of a world abandoned by God. I mean, it's a secular form, but that is not a that's not an easy or straightforward thing to have happened. That's a huge and problematic thing to have happened. And of course, what Lukács is getting at there is the separation from what he takes to be the world of the epic, which which is a world in which God is essentially present, which is also to say, I mean, it's a different regime precisely in the Rancièrean sense, which is to say, it's an unproblematic world. The world of the epic is an unproblematic world, in the same way that the religious world is an unproblematic world by implication to for Lukács. So I think that what happens for Lukács in the novel is that literature becomes problematic, which means that meaning becomes problematic, which means that the question of God becomes problematic, which means that the place of man in the world becomes problematic. It doesn't mean we don't have, religious literature. I mean, you mentioned Rushdie. Rushdie. I mean, The Satanic Verses is a novel that is absolutely about the transition from the world of the epic to the world of the novel. It's about that problematic. I mean, it's one of the, it's amazing that he was subjected to a fatwa, given that the notion of secularism is so overtly, exactly what he's kind of trying to think through in that novel. I'm very interested in writers who, in certain writers who apparently write religious novels, in particular Flannery O'Connor, who apparently writes or attempts to write in those, certainly in those the two novels she wrote, The Vile and Buried Away and Wise Blood, a novel that is informed by a notion of religious revelation. She seems to be doing that. She seems to be trying to do that, and yet it is certainly a secular novel. It is certainly a novel that abides by all of the forms of secularity that Lukács essentially identifies in the novel. So I think the question is a problematic that you're alluding to, and a very super interesting one. About the question about work and labor. So actually a while since I read The Human Condition, but I'm sure that your reference to labor and work in Arendt are precisely playing onto that that distinction I was trying to make earlier. In relationship to Marx's earliest writings, he's a big reference for that. Those early writings are a reference for Arendt, but it's a while since I've been reading Arendt. Although The Human Condition I used to know quite well, that book.
Great. Alec Wood, you're up next. And just so everybody has a sense of the lay of the land, there's about 10 people on stack now, so there's lots of questions, and there might be more people who add on later. So let's just try to keep everything as concise and straightforward as possible so that we can get everybody in. So Alec, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak to us today. My question pertains more towards the political implications of Rancière and Deleuze and Guattari's dissolution of art into general social technique. And here I'm referring to a book I recently read by John Roberts called Revolutionary Time in the Avant-Garde. And he criticizes the Deleuzian Guattarian, for Deleuze, like the transversal nomadic model of art, just getting rid of boundaries altogether, and more implicitly Rancière's aesthetic regime, that they essentially let neoliberalism in the back door by denying art its specific capacity to critique capitalism through artistic autonomy, which was an interesting take for me because I'm quite new to this area, and I had just associated autonomy with a more conservative art viewpoint in general. I'm just kind of curious to hear more of your thoughts on that argument. You think it's a good critique of Rancière and Deleuze, and does it reveal anything about the supposed questionable Marxist basis that was kind of discussed earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that particular book actually by John Roberts, although I know his work in general, and I admire him. He's an art critic for the most part. He's not really doesn't really, as far as I know, write about literature. I think it's a very substantive critique of Rancière and Deleuze to say that they let neoliberalism in through the back door. I mean, I think it's a substantial critique. It needs to be addressed and thought through. I'm not remotely dismissive of it. I think it's it requires thinking through. And if we think about the moment that we're in the United States, and we think about the the sort of like the free fall of fact-based, of facts in political discourse. I mean, the sort of like the line from a sort of like postmodernism to neoliberalism is a very kind of like small and straightforward one, and has been invoked many times. I need to look at that book to sort of like figure out if John is doing something more sort of complex and interesting than that. I'm sure it is, but it's a real critique, and I sort of disagree with it, but I'm not. I would need to kind of get into the details to
Great.
to properly refute it.
Rebecca, I think you're up next. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going right back to the very early days of this chat, and I'm thinking about what you were saying about reification and about form and the resolution of dissonance. And I'm wondering how this changes when we look at the creative process itself rather than its outcome. And I should probably say very quickly, I'm approaching this as a musician, I'm a violinist, and my interest right now is in the way that subject-object relations change when we become immersed in what we're doing. Particularly because there's a huge loss of self-awareness that accompanies these moments, and there's a sort of, there's a sort of structural collapse in the hierarchy of subject and object. And at these points, the project tends to change and shoot off in all sorts of unexpected directions. And so important ways at these moments, I think that the subject loses its agential authority over the outcome. And there's a sort of redistribution of agency. And I'm seeing this as a point of real consonance and a resolution of the sort of traditional Marxian antinomy of subject and object. But the thing is that once the process is finished, once the book is written, once the painting is painted, the performance is completed, these things stand before us as our object. And that subject-object relationship it becomes sort of ossified again. And so I'm wondering if in fact form is in fact not a resolution of dissonance, but the negation of a crucial consonance. It's sort of become the form, the art as form is the negation of its own processes. And I'm wondering if in fact, so I guess I'm really wondering if form is a decoy in a certain way. It ties into the sort of commodity notion of the object, the reified object. It's sort of beholden to the structural relations between subject and object that seem to be embedded in capitalism. And so I'm wondering if in a certain way, there's a crucial revolutionary moment that lurks within this immersive creative process that in fact becomes obscured and buried by the very notion of art as a form.
Yeah, that's lovely, Rebecca. Thank you so much. I mean, by the way, other people might have answers to these questions, but in any case, your question is very. I mean, you're probably aware of this, but it's a very sort of Deleuzian question in a sense, because the it is precisely art and art expression, creativity in a kind of understanding those things as processes and activities that precisely allows a kind of escape and a transcendence of those subject-object relations, right. And in fact, in some sense, abolishes them. I mean, so this is really one of the reasons why someone like Deleuze is so interested in art, and not as an activity to be privileged, but as a model for a kind of a way of living that is not subject, not predicated upon the sovereignty of the subject. And I think you're also completely right then to say that form is not just the resolution, but perhaps the negation of the of something, right? There are moments when within Lukács where he will sort of express he will seem to express a desire or an intense sense of the loss that is experienced in form itself. I think that when he talks about a world abandoned by God, he's expressing what you're also expressing in a sense, which is to say that world of sort of immanence when I as a painting or singing or performing subject was no longer defined or was not yet defined or determined by my status as a performing or playing subject. In other words, my activity was was precisely in continuity with the world, and I was not alienated from it. I mean, what he talks about as a world abandoned by God is a world that's not yet alienated. Marx, I think, in those early writings we were talking about earlier, expresses a similar kind of subject-object continuity, and I think that when you talk about form in that way, I think you're completely, in conversation with these thinkers, and doing so precisely from the position of a practitioner is super interesting to hear that.
Great, thank you both. Dragana, I believe you're up next. Dragana, could you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi.
Here you are.
Yeah, can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for this really interesting lecture. My question is maybe similar to the previous one, because it is related to the contemporary art practices, and I'm especially interested in this aesthetic regime when Rancière talks about it, and the way he talks about the distribution of the sensible, and the way that art can affect this distribution in the field of the sensible, because in the art, when we perceive art, we do that, we are engaging in all our senses. So I'm very interested in specific, what Gabriel mentioned, in specific examples, because Rancière doesn't give much, at least I didn't find it. Okay, he said that the purpose of these strategies in art is to make this invisible visible, or to this, so, but in the concrete, in some specific examples I didn't find. So if you can help me with that, especially maybe with this contemporary art practices in, I don't know, community based art practices, project-based art practices, which are, there are relations between author and participants involved, and all this, what he refers as politicals, are social, or in the ways that production, when he talks about production of the art, it's always about this social phenomena outside of the art field, but he never talks about this materiality, if we can call that materiality of the artwork. So if you can help me with that a little bit, I don't know if I was clear with my, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dragana. Yeah, I mean, I find it, yes, I agree with you that in terms of specific art practices, Rancière is not very satisfactory. It's all the analysis is undertaken at a very large on a very large scale. And what I find very interesting is that artists in real kind of political situations have found Rancière very useful, and particularly have found him useful in terms of this notion of the distribution of the sensible. I was in Beijing a few years ago, and I was taken on a tour of is it called the 793 Art District? Is that what it's called? And saw a lot of studios. And I had been giving some lectures on Rancière, and I was kind of amazed to talk with several artists who had been influenced by Rancière to produce work that was critical in certain kind of overt and non-overt ways of the political regime, and it was around the time of the Tiananmen, of the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square event, and they were using Rancière as a kind of inspiration, and Rancière has been taken up in those ways. And I at the time, and maybe still, I find it very strange to think about Rancière as a figure to whom one might go to as a guide to making precisely committed art. It doesn't sort of compute for me with his project at all. So, for example, some of the practices that you were describing, a sort of relational aesthetics kind of practice, or a practice that really do try to establish a certain redistribution of the sensible. There's never any kind of there's never any statement as to this being a good, or a progressive practice, or not a progressive or a kind of practice. I mean, Rancière never makes statements of that kind, and I think this is the consistency with which he does not make any kind of normative statements like that. Is what is both really enigmatic about his project, and it can be sort of frustrating, but I also think that is the project, and so apart from that, I can't quite sort of draw out a direction or a use of Rancière for the practices that you're describing, unfortunately.
Okay, Constance, you're up next. As you're unmuting yourself, I might just mention to Dragana, if you haven't read The Emancipated Spectator, and particularly the French version, if you happen to read French, it is one of the places where he engages more directly with these kind of relational practices. But again, as Timothy was just saying, it's very oblique and quite distant. And I think the argument is shot through with some very serious problems, but it's at least a kind of textual reference. So Constance, go ahead and jump in.
Hey, hi Timothy.
Hello.
And hi everybody. Well, in the first part of the encounter, Gabriel introduced the possibility of a materialist account of the forces that intervene in different cultural productions. And this would be, to me, an answer to the question about the possibility to exit the aesthetic regime. We should look into cultural practices that have been excluded and look at the canon, at the actual canon, from its exterior. So I believe that this question about the possibility to exit, the question about what is outside, in this case outside the aesthetic regime, is by definition a materialist question. And well, Timothy, in the last lines of the chapter we've read, you discussed the idea of an aesthetic that embraces that there is a limit to the form, which to me is again an excess to the form, something that is outside the form. It is another way to pose the question about outsideness and the possibility of an exit. And so my question may be direct to aesthetics in a broader sense, in a more general sense. Do you think that there is another realm, a non-aesthetic realm, where we could find this possibility of outsideness, of newness, to call it in another way?
Thank you, Costanza. How to answer? It's a very nice question. I think that the way I would like to think about it is, it's not that there is a non-aesthetic realm exactly. It's that if we think about aesthetics, the aesthetic regime in terms of form, which is kind of how in the end how I'm wanting to do it. Form always implies limits, the limitations of form. And I think that my own sort of approach to Rancière has been to try to insist that, and also to Lukács, to try to insist that the very notion of form, the very notion of regime presupposes a limitation, or limits to the form, limits to the regime. And if there's an exit, it's not quite an exit. It's more the fact of a limit, and that it's on the limit to form and on the limit to the regime. And those limits, as Rancière himself insists, are also inherent to the very thinking of the notion of a regime. So that has to be, that has to be I think that has to be the way to read Rancière, despite the fact, even insofar as Rancière himself will insist that the aesthetic regime is the, you know, is the category for thinking about art in the moment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Great. We still have a lot of questions and increasingly limited time. Would anyone be offended if we grouped 2 or 3 questions together, and then Timothy could kind of either, if there are questions that overlap, just respond once, or tease out particular threads? Shake your head in utter dismay if you're against that. Otherwise, maybe we could hear Leah and then Lawrence and Zia Wen, and then Timothy, I'll turn the floor back over to you. So Leah, if you could start us out.
Okay.
I must have raised my hand accidentally.
No
I'll
worries.
step back.
No worries. Okay. So Lawrence, you're up next.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, and also thank you all for your questions so far, because they also made me rethink what I actually wanted to ask. So shortly going back again to this question of committed literature or committed art, also from the perspective of an interest in activist or so-called militant art. I'm always stunned by this very common gesture that you find in all these kinds of aesthetic theories, from Adorno to Rancière, and also to some extent in Deleuze, where you always have a very outright dismissal of openly, let's say, political art or activist art, which I'm really trying to, I'm grappling with now also in my project. There seems to be a prevailing assumption in all these aesthetic theories that the more openly political work is, the less effective it can be in transforming something like the distribution of the sensible or having any effect on it. So I'm wondering if you would agree with this, that there is somewhat an irreducibly idealistic core to this argument, to all these positions. In some ways, I even find Adorno he's sometimes more merciless on the point of even the seemingly most autonomous artwork is still part of a certain totality of ideologically. The form of the artwork itself is an ideological form, because it repeats on a certain level this primordial division of labor, where the artist, what you basically started off with in the beginning, the artist is consigned a certain exceptional privileged role vis-a-vis society, vis-a-vis politics, vis-a-vis other fields of human practice. And I'm really grappling with this somehow idealistic, really irreducible core, especially in Rancière. Once he talks about cinema, he heavily dismisses the Godard's somehow militant turn in the after 68, even though there were very explicit reasons, cultural, aesthetic, and political reasons to somehow step away from the commercial distribution of his films, in Godard's case, to making somewhat of an underground Marxist, openly Marxist film. So how do you deal with this idealist core? And is it perhaps even indispensable from any aesthetic theory? That would be the somehow follow-up question.
That's a fantastic question. I wish we had an hour to discuss it and unpack it, but we're gonna try to get Zia Wen and Esteban in as well. So Zia Wen, go ahead. And then Timothy, you can weave together a response as you see fit. So Zia Wen?
Okay, I just want to back to the beginning of this question. I'm very interesting in this question, and that reminds me about Frederick Jameson also point out that Lukács is always thinking about a relationship between the narrative of history and the sensation of reality. And as we know, Lukács sharply divided a 19th century realism novelists Dickens, Balzac, and Scott and Tolstoy. and this is artists and scholars actively like engage in the social fighting at a time, and their experience and make them become authors and novelists, and this is values and their values and what a view is like really connected with their books and kind of like I think Lukács doesn't think this kind of like a novelist is not like a capitalist conceptual like novelist, but like a Flaubert and Zola, and this is novelist is like become like a bourgeoisie, like because like as like Lukács says, like because they are too like they are too great and too honest, and they cannot like really like become the defender of capitalism, and they cannot like engage in the bourgeoisie life, and they become like a critical observer of capitalism society, and they are like Lukács critique about them because like they are consciously being marginalized because they degenerate from like experience to observe, like become like more like observer but not like experience sense, like engage in this reality. And I think like a tragedy of like Flaubert's self-contradiction is because they accept what they opposed as objective like doctrine and surrender for such thing because they think this kind of thing is like unsolvable facts. And like Lukács also says like they cannot find an intrinsic point of life. And like I think like Western Marxist essential question is how does art has revolutionary power in this alienation world? And Benjamin also points that they are like a kind of reasonable there must be the art should be has the reasonable facts like in art area and the aesthetic area, and then it can be reasonable for the politics area. And and its revolutionary power is not the political tendency but the integrity of reflect the reality. And if that, I think like maybe Lukács is like divided from the aesthetic from the politics, if that is right.
Okay, great. And then can I get Esteban's question in too? Is that okay, Timothy, or are we gonna overload you?
No,
okay,
no.
Esteban, if you could jump in.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the talk and well, for the conversation in general. Very interesting. Well, I have two very short questions that also related with what has been asked already. But anyway, so yeah, my first question is whether this form or work of art in its more in its aspect more related to the form has well anything or could be characterized in terms of experience, not this dichotomical experience separating observer and work of art, but the experience of writing, the experience and so on. And the second question is about well the non-institutional, non-historical aspects of your account. So even if you say that you are not focusing on them, which role do they play for your notion or the notion of novel or work of art you're considering, in the sense that, for example, well, whatever it is that's not intellectual regarding a work of art, it's called non-intellectual after a bunch of historical processes and institutional processes. So and also whatever it's not intellectual in that point of history, of art history, of literature history, it can be institutionalized, and anything that it's not intellectual will be institutionalized. I think this conversation is an example of that. So I would be very interested on those things. Thank you.
Great. Tim, I'll turn it over to you. Don't feel like you have to give authoritative responses to everything that was brought up, because we have 4 more questions after that,
Okay.
but anything you'd like to add in reaction would be great.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Lorenz, is there an irreducibly idealistic quality to the positions that trying to disavow explicitly political activist art? Yes, is the answer. I completely agree that is the right way to do that.
That was quick, Timothy. Very good.
And anyway, I feel the same way about Rancière's critique of Godard. Like, you know, I mean, why? Anyway, but my answer is yes. Adorno, I think, is the strongest in a way in anyway. That's my. I won't say any more. That's my quick answer, and I think you formulated it really well. And in terms of the critique of Rancière on Godard, I completely agree with you. Is it indispensable to any aesthetic theory? I kind of think so as well. So, in other words, that aesthetic theory may not be, we maybe should not be exactly understanding our activity as theorizing aesthetics. And in fact, this is why I understand my own activity in my current writing as not theorizing the novel, because I think the novel is an untheorizable form. Ziwan Lin, your question is really, I mean, it's a question about realism, and the real, you know, classic, you know, the classic, in a way, distinction that you're drawing out between a literature that by a kind of attentive attention to, you know, the forces and relations that are playing out in society, precisely has a deep political resonance, precisely in not articulating a kind of political program or regime, and that's certainly Lukács's commitment, the explanation for Lukács's commitment to realism. But I think you're touching on the same question, which is to say, is realism necessarily a you know, a program? Should it necessarily be programmatic or not? And I think that you know, these. I mean, and I take Esteban's question to be touching on the same issue. Really, actually the 3 questions are quite closely related. If I'm hearing you correctly, which is to say, can we in the current moment really sustain a normative approach to aesthetic practice, particularly in the negative sense? In other words, you know, should we really be ruling out a certain kind of aesthetic practice or artistic practice or intellectual practice, intellectually informed practice, on the basis that one form or another can be institutionalized in one way or another, or can be used for purposes other than the ones that the artist might be wanting to recommend? And I just think that you know, all of you are in a sense correct in the. I mean, I agree with the nervousness that you have around the normative side of these questions. If that covers it, but I'm not sure if I quite caught, because I wasn't sure what Esteban, what you quite meant by intellectual.
It's probably a pretty big question at this hour. I don't know if Esteban, probably. You have a quick and fast response.
Maybe that's yeah. Maybe I don't have really in mind what intellectual is, but
well,
I mean whatever Timothy has in mind, whatever we call non-intellectual should have its base in history and art history.
Right.
And whatever it is, it could be institutionalized. It could be intellectualized, so to say, after this kinds of conversation, for example.
Right.
Well, in the interest of time, I think I'll cut off after this, but we do have 4 more questions. And so if it's okay, again, I'll just group them all together. And Timothy, you did an excellent job. Your concision of the yes/no answer was spot on.
Thank you.
Sorry to do this, but I want to make sure I know other people have time constraints. We're obviously going to go 10 minutes over or so, but some people have to get to work and other such things. So if we could start with Trang. Go ahead.
Yep. Thank you. So to return to Gabriel's original insistence on the production, distribution, and reception of cultural works, my question is about the phenomenon of an artwork or an artifact that was produced in one culture, in this case, a colonized country, and then displaced toward often annexation and so on from that culture and display in museums in private homes of now the colonizing country. So I guess when there is a domination power relation between the artist and the artwork and the reception, the receivers of such artwork, then in your opinion, do you think that the degree 0 principle of connection that was mentioned in your article, that was thing that was not present, that was muted, reveal or can account for this materialist history of the object itself, of the artwork? And would Rancière, I never read his work beside this article, so I thank him for that, for introducing me to him. Would he see this as this line of interpretation as part of his whatever democratic or liberatory project? Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Melissa, go ahead.
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Thank you for both the chapter that you circulated and for this great talk. My question is really, I just want to hear more, and there may not be time, which is totally fine, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about absence, which kind of comes in towards the end of the chapter with Van Velde, I don't know which the pronunciation is.
Oh, yes,
but,
Van Velde, yeah.
Van Velde. So it comes in with this, this idea of the absence of a sense of absence. And then, and then on the very last page, you write that to insist, as does Rancière, that there is no unrepresentable or unspeakable element in the aesthetic regime may be the only consistent way to reserve a place of thought at the limits of form. How better to do justice to the unrepresentable than by refusing to acknowledge it? How else to register the unspeakable than by not speaking, right? And then you conclude with Rancière and Deleuze. This not expressing the expressive predicament becomes the expression. So again, if there's time, if not, I don't want to keep people, but I would just love to hear more about how absence or silence or not saying things plays into your larger project.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks again.
Fantastic. Alan, you're up next if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, so real quick, I was just wondering about this section earlier on in the chapter where you sort of introduced this tension between the work that the aesthetic regime is doing to sort of disrupt this process of reification and all the sort of like sort of oppressive and like limiting norms that come with that, but also how it has to sort of, or like seemingly has to sort of take on like a universal character in order to be like a diagnostic of like the modern, of like actual modern like aesthetic practice. So I would like to call our attention just real quick to a moment where you write on page 13, Rockhill characterizes the universalism of Rancière's project as a polemical universal, one that exists solely in concrete acts of struggle rather than as some a priori abstract foundation. I was interested in just hearing a little bit more on how the kind of mode of or form that that the work is doing can sort of take on this this you know, additional property.
Okay. Great, thanks so much. And I think Asan, you'll have the last question then, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. I really enjoyed your paper. I guess I'll keep it brief, and I guess Gabriel is also someone that can respond to the answer as well. I suppose since I do dabble in critical theory as a graduate student, but alongside I also work as a filmmaker as well. And it's always been interesting to me where there's been an aesthetic turn in like political theory, and where like certain radical questions have been ejected from other, I guess, conversations into the aesthetic realm where they won't necessarily fit into. And I just thought, I was just wondering how you see this aesthetic turn when it comes to politics, especially when there's the whole global south that I guess you have other solutions like actor network theory and other theorists that give very impoverished answers of a kind of present that hasn't been addressed. And sometimes the aesthetic seems to be, it just comes off to me, and I'm not as well read about it because I'm still learning about it, a kind of evasion from addressing some of the material concerns that end up happening within it. So I just thought I'd just maybe hear your thoughts, and perhaps with Gabriel, does the aesthetic term maybe account for a kind of a border of left critique of some sorts of like delimiting or negating, I guess, certain kind of criticisms that may happen in critical theory by kind of pigeonholing it into the aesthetic? I apologize if I was incoherent. I was just trying to think on the spot about that. Thank you.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks for the great questions. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, where to start? The question of the question was really, does Rancière take explicit note of the moments when a particular object is recontextualized and perhaps appears under very different conditions of viewing and spectatorship than the conditions in which the object was produced, such as, for example, in a work produced in a colonized country that shows up in a museum in the metropolitan center. That's a very interesting, it's a very, very interesting question. And I don't think he does, but I don't think he does really, which is kind of, yeah, I don't think he does. I mean, that's what can I say? Gabriel, does he? I don't know. I don't remember that as a kind of, I mean, I don't remember there being any sort of real part of his frame, his aesthetic frame in terms of the distribution of perception or distribution of the sensible that involves the possibility of a radical recontextualization and a work meaning something in a radically different context than the one in which it was produced. It seems to me that the notion of a distribution of the sensible as a answer to the question of the politics of aesthetics is one that seems to be rooted in a specific context of production and of historical production and of historical reception. That's my sense of that question. But it may be more complicated than that. Melissa, thank you. Nice to see you, Melissa. The question of the absence of a sense of yes, you ask about the end, the last. Really, it's the thing I want to say is about the last moment of the paper, where you correctly, I think, identify a moment where I'm asking silence and absence to do a huge amount of conceptual work, and I am asking it to do a huge amount of conceptual work there, and I'm resting a lot on it. And I think it's a polemic. I mean, it's a polemical moment in my own paper. It's a moment where I'm not that confident about it. I think it's a gesture towards the risk of the project, largely. So you've identified that I'm drawn towards the Bram van Velde and Beckett's reading of him in that moment, and yeah, that's exactly what I'm what I'm trying to do, is say this is what, if we're going to talk about limitations of conceptual thinking, then let's think about, you know, rhetorical absence. Let's think about what it means not to say something. And I want to bring into the conceptual frame, in a sense, not saying something about something, which I think is what Rancière is doing there. So thank you for noticing that. Alan, can you just, I can't quite remember what your question was.
Alan was next, I believe.
Oh, Alan, yes, that's right.
If the question's not fresh, Alan can restate it if it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I can sort of try and reform it if that would help.
I mean, you were asking about, yeah, sorry, I somehow lost it.
We've been berating you with questions for 2 hours, Tim. It's surprising that this didn't happen much earlier. So Alan, would you like to just concisely reformulate your question?
Right. So I think the most concisely I can put it would be how to resolve the tension between the sort of like particular elements in the aesthetic regime and like it's sort of like backdoor kind of universal elements, if you just want to speak to that tension at all.
Yeah, there was something I wanted to say in relationship to it, but I've somehow I can't quite access it. I'm really sorry, I can't quite access it. There was something I know that you asked, and I thought it was really important, and I'm somehow I can't access it. Can I? Maybe I'll answer Hassan's question, and that might jog my memory. So, yes, I think that this is a. I mean, the question of the question of of Western aesthetic theory when it comes to practices, aesthetic practices in what you call the global South, and also the degree to which critical theory itself undertakes a certain kind of aesthetic turn. Well, I think it's a really complex question. It's a really good one. And what does it mean to what is an aesthetic turn? I mean, is the Frankfurt School, for example, an aesthetic turn within the history of Western Marxist theory? I mean, is Western Marxism precisely an aesthetic turn? Maybe it is. In other words, I think maybe what your question is gesturing towards is that the aesthetic turn within critical theory, these moments also have to be rigorously thought through and examined as historical and as moments. I mean, is the Deleuze Foucault turn in May in 1968 and afterwards an evasion precisely of the sort of what was perceived as a sort of dead end, of the kind of protesting that was happening globally and in particular in Paris and America. Yes, I mean, it's a reconfiguration and a reframing of the project, and it's strategic and it needs to be historicized, and it's always there for reasons that may be both positive and negative, strategic and also evasive. So I just think it's a very large question, a really important one, yes, and so I just broadly would say that, And then, oh yes, the question that, Alan, I know what I wanted to say, because it was actually alluding to Gabriel's characterization of Rancière's project. So I actually wanted to go to Gabriel and say, you're the person that should address this question of the characterizing Rancière's project as a polemical universal. Yeah.
Since I've been putting you on the spot for 2 hours, now you're going to put me on the spot. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I would say something very quickly, but I don't want to go on at length because of the time constraints, and also that we're mainly focusing on your work. But I do think there's a tension operative in Rancière, and that tension is between a kind of Foucaultian transcendentalism in which he looks at cultural particulars, and it's a Hegelianism as well, and he's trying to find some system that is above and determines, or below, depending on the metaphor that you want to use, determines all of the cultural particulars. And there are some fundamental problems with that particular approach that I think he's aware of as well. And so another direction that he tends to push in is that a cultural particular, so a work of art, only manifests elements of a particular regime insofar as they take on an idiosyncratic form and don't necessarily reveal some type of totalizing structure. But I also think that these are unresolved issues methodologically in Rancière, and I do think that ultimately he remains very, very close to a Foucaultian transcendentalism. And in many ways, Timothy, I take it that that's part of what you're diagnosing, right? That there's almost like this epistemic capture in Foucaultian terms of the aesthetic regime, and that given its Eurocentrism, given its lack of a materialist account of the institutions that produce the bourgeois practice of art, there are a whole series of questions that one might want to raise about this gesture. And I take it that Timothy's work is inviting us in.
Yes, exactly. Are you Gabriel, you've frozen.
Limitations. Can everyone still, okay, the screen froze for a second, but yeah. I think we're back.
We missed a little bit of but
okay, it's probably all good. What I mainly wanted to do, and this is difficult to do over Zoom, is to thank Timothy Bewes for coming in and spending 2 hours being interrogated by us. We greatly appreciated it.
Well,
so
no,
I don't know how people can clap.
Really nice. Thank you. Really, the thanks are from me, really, for the invitation, for the engagement. This is the first this is the first circulation of this piece of work that I have done. I mean, you guys are the first to have read it. So I really appreciate the questions and the engagement. It's massively helpful to me. So thank you. Truly.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions and the reading.
Well, I'm sure